Hey Art Nerds! Today I have a mixed media marker tutorial inspired by the class that I taught with the Nashville Plaza in November. So the materials we're going to use today are alcohol markers. You can use the ones of your choice, but I'm going to be using Copic markers, and the watercolors of your choice. I'm going to use the Core Mini Palette. And I am beginning with a sketch done in a watercolor sketchbook. This is, I believe, the Montval watercolor sketchbook, and this sketch was done in Color Eno Pink Lead. And the reason I chose this lead is because it plays very nicely with both watercolor and with alcohol marker. And I have tutorials where I walk you through creating lineless marker art and lineless watercolor art. These are the colors that I have selected for this piece, and as I go along I may grab additional colors to augment what I'm doing. So I'm going to begin by adding a little bit of blue shadow to Kara's eyes, and I'm going to start by blocking in the grass. Now, I don't have a color chart available to tell you exactly what colors to use, but honestly, you guys should be working on your color theory and not necessarily relying too heavily on the colors that I use. So for the purposes of this tutorial, I am using a light yellow green. If you guys hear a strange mechanical sound in the background, that is Bowie's little auto mouse toy. I found that it is very helpful for keeping him entertained while I'm recording, so no hopping on and off the lap. So that's what that noise is. I am using the brush quite extensively to create the blades of grass. Now, in some of my cheap alcohol marker tutorials, field tests, and unbox and swatch videos, I talk about how much I don't like using a bullet nib for this. You guys can kind of see why. So for the foreground, I'm using a darker, more blue-green. Now, generally, with atmospheric perspective, we would start with our brightest, most saturated, maybe more yellow colors in the foreground, and our darker, less saturated, more blue influence colors in the background. However, for this, I want it to look like the sun is hitting the background behind her, and that's going to kind of pop things out a little bit. So that's why I've kind of reversed the color theory for this. Now, if you guys are interested in learning more about atmospheric perspective and how you can use it in your illustrations, I have a tutorial that I'm going to link down in the description below. So make sure you check that out. It's going to be full of all sorts of awesome goodies. Also, if you guys have any questions, I'm not so sure if YouTube will allow me to put comments on this video, but you guys can always reach out to me over on my Discord channel, the Paint Box. I'll drop a link for that. Please do link the video that you have questions about so I can actually see what you're talking about. It really helps me out a lot. So for the foreground leaves, I did another layer using an even cooler, darker blue-green, and now I'm starting in with her skin. And I have loads of tutorials here on this channel for selecting good skin tone triads. I have tutorials on rendering different types of skin tones. I have tutorials where I've walked you through my process for Kara. So I'm not really going to walk you guys through that too much. I applied my base tone using a lot of the white of the paper, and then I'm starting to develop the colors with darker, more saturated colors, and then I blend back out as I go. So I apply a layer and then I blend it out. And what that does is it kind of softens the look of the marker. So we are working with a watercolor paper, and as I've talked about in some of my other marker tutorials, watercolor papers play very nicely with alcohol markers, but they're very thirsty. So at this point, I am using a very light pink. It's like a shell pink or a skin tone pink. I'm using a very light pink just to add a little bit of blush to her cheek, and I'm using a very light blue violet to add a little bit of shadow. So watercolor papers are quite thirsty when it comes to alcohol markers. That's just something you might want to keep in mind. You can do a lot of blending on these types of papers, but they may drain your markers out. So now I'm starting in with her hair, and I'm using a very light orange color. This is Kara from my comic, 7-Inch Kara. You can read the first 5 chapters for free at 7inchkara.com or 7inchkara.tumblr.com, and I'm also working on the upcoming Volume 2 Kickstarter. If you guys are interested in following along with my comic work, I do have a mailing list for that, and I'll have that in the description as well. She's a really cute Lilliputian girl who is seeking larger-than-life adventure. She wants to find out what the world is like outside her very limited experience, and in the process, she befriends a human teenager and her pet kitten Pancake. So it's a really cute comic. It's done all in watercolor, and I think you guys will really enjoy it. So I am developing the hair color, kind of building up the shadow, and for this illustration I wanted something that was very light and sunlit and kind of warming. You guys can see I'm not really taking any special precautions in terms of the lead that I used. It is a colored lead, so there's no graphite in it, and I really happen to like the Color Eno leads for alcohol marker use. So I will have a link to the materials that I talk about in this video and that I recommend in the description as well. And as always, I should caveat, if I am using Amazon links, I do see a small affiliate bounty that goes to help support the work that I do here on this channel, and it doesn't cost you any extra that comes out of Amazon's pocket. Speaking of ways you can support the work that I do here on this channel, I do have a Patreon, and you guys can join me at patreon.com/natosoup. My wonderful art nerds on Patreon got this video first. So I wanted this to be I talked about warm and sunlit, but I was kind of also thinking like a warm sort of harvest day. I don't do a lot of fall stuff, and since Kara is a Lilliputian, there would be a lot of gathering and collecting of materials to prepare for winter. So I have here her holding maybe some wheat or some edible grasses that contain grains, and I'm using sort of warmer yellows and buttery colors to render those in. And I'm working from yellow to darker browns to add my shadow. Now, for this piece, I'm not really concerned about adding a lot of shadow at this point. I'm concerned about building up depth and building up color, but I am saving most of my shadow work, most of my color influence for when I add the watercolor later. And one of the reasons I really love doing alcohol markers with watercolor in terms of mixed media is you maintain the saturation and the color vibrancy of the alcohol marker, but you get to add more depth and more nuance. And I particularly like using this technique when I'm doing like succulent drawings, when I'm drawing succulents, because they have such vibrant colors, but it's also important to kind of capture the depth and the shadow so that the forms are more easily understood. And I have a lot of videos here on this channel where I walk you through painting succulents using markers and watercolor for succulents, so I highly recommend you guys check those out as well. So I'm using some of the same colors that I used on the wheat to color the basket of blueberries on her head, and I'm going to start coloring the blueberries, and I'm actually going to use a blue as a base tone and then a garnet to color over it. And what that does is it creates this sort of really intense purple that I'm looking for. It's kind of a desaturated purple. It's more like what blueberries look like than any color that Copic offers pre-mixed. So I'm using a really cool dark blue and a really cool dark red. So basically what I'm doing with the markers is I'm using it to establish our local color, our base colors, and then I'm going to use our watercolor layered on top of this to kind of achieve color depth and color saturation, and also to add further details. So I'm putting most of my rendering attention onto Kara, and I'm kind of leaving the background light, and that I'm going to use the watercolor to really render out the rest of the background. So if you guys are curious, that image we saw at the beginning of the video, that's what the end piece is going to look like. So that's kind of what I'm going for. And unfortunately, since I did this piece with colored leads, I don't have a printable for you guys to use, but I encourage you to try these techniques along with me and to try this out yourself. All right, so we are just about finished with the alcohol marker. I've pulled out my core mini palette and I am using my non-porous craft surface. It's a white Teflon sheet. I'd gotten a lot of complaints because people didn't like the brown Teflon sheet, but honestly, I don't like the white Teflon sheet. Anyway, I'm using that as my mixing surface, and I have some of Core's beautiful ultramarine blue, and I'm just applying it to the background. Now, one of the really cool things about using watercolor with alcohol marker is the watercolor is not going to reactivate the alcohol marker. It's not going to push the marker to the back of the paper like if we were using more alcohol marker with it. So you can really layer your color, and you can use the watercolor to really tone and shift your colors. Now, if you want to do mixed media with watercolor, I do recommend you do your alcohol marker first and then do your watercolor on top of it. Now, down at the grass at the bottom, I've added a cool phthalo blue, and this really kind of creates some depth and some lusciousness to the grass. And I'm just kind of pulling that up into the sun-kissed grass, so the yellow-green grass in the background. Then I'm adding another layer of ultramarine blue to the sky. Now the sky being kind of bowl-shaped, well, not literally, but the atmosphere is bowl-shaped because it curves around the earth. It is darker at the top than it actually is at the bottom. And I see a lot of artists kind of do it the reverse, where they do the top of the sky very light and the bottom very dark. And I'm sure on some days it does look like that, but I'm literally looking out my window right now, and the sky closer to the horizon line is much lighter than the sky towards the bowl of the sky. So that's just something you might want to keep in mind when you're painting skies yourself. And I'm using a thicker mix of the phthalo blue to draw in more grass strokes into the grass. And that's creating kind of a richer, more full grass look, but it's very quick to do. It's quicker than doing it in just marker alone, and it allows us to build up a lot of color depth. Now, for this tutorial, I'm keeping things very simple, very basic. You can go much more detailed than this. You can really spend a lot of time rendering both in marker and in watercolor. And if you guys are curious to see how a piece finished that way would look, let me know and I'll try to work on one for you guys. But since this was a demonstration that I created for my mixed media markers class, I wanted to keep it very simple and attainable and just very quickly demonstrate what is possible with alcohol markers. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I have a figure in the foreground and I want to paint or I want to marker the sky, if I don't use masking frisket to mask off the character, coloring in the sky can become kind of tedious. But doing it in watercolor is much, much quicker, and we're using a lot less marker ink. So that's another thing with going mixed media, is that it's really very economical because both materials can go a long way. I do think watercolor goes a little bit longer. You need a little bit less watercolor if you're going to use it over your alcohol marker. So I do think it's a good way to kind of stretch the colors that you have and get more out of your collection. So I am using a dioxine purple to shade the red on her dress. And I really didn't spend a lot of time or attention to rendering out her dress because I knew I wanted to add a lot of the shadow using watercolor. And I'm doing the same for her leggings as well. Now, if I'd been smart, I would have taped this down. I would have secured it to another surface. You guys can see it is starting to buckle. We did work on a cellulose-based watercolor paper. I actually have not tried alcohol markers on a cotton rag paper, but I need to do that and get back to you guys because I'm just as curious as you are to see how well that would work. But I have success with using alcohol markers on cellulose paper. So like Canson Montval, Canson Biggie XL, Strathmore watercolor paper, any of those cellulose-based watercolor papers will work well with this technique. I'm going into the wheat using probably a burnt umber just to add some more detail and adding some shadow to her basket as well. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to her skin, kind of developing those shadows a little bit more. Again, you guys can refine and work your piece as much as you want. You can spend a lot of time on it. I would not necessarily recommend going back and forth between the alcohol marker and the watercolor. Once you finish your alcohol marker stage, then don't go back to the alcohol markers. And the reason I say that is you wouldn't want to ruin the tips on your markers with the watercolor pigments. So now that I have everything painted and markered, I'm going in and adding white highlights with P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. A while back, I reviewed a bunch of different white correctional fluids, and I found that this one is the most opaque and the best for sort of adding white highlights. But if you wanted to go back in and paint in white clouds, I would actually recommend you use white gouache rather than the opaque white. And I'm just kind of using it to pull in some highlights, to adjust the contrast, and to kind of clean things up a little bit. I'm also bringing it down into the grass because it was starting to get a little bit mushy, so I'm adding back some white highlights. And then once that's had a chance to dry, I'm actually using a black Sakura Pigma Pro FB. That's the fine point brush pen. I'm using that to just kind of ink things, tighten things up, and adjust the contrast. You could use colored brush pens, colored gel pens at this point, and that would add kind of a different feeling to the overall piece. When you use black, it definitely changes the contrast and it definitely darkens things up a little bit. So it pays to kind of play around with different color brush pens and figure out what you like for your art and what you want for that specific piece. Now, even though I am inking this after it has been markered and watercolored, I could have started with the inks because this marker, or this brush pen, apologies, is both alcohol marker proof and waterproof. It's one of my favorite brush pens and I highly recommend it. So this is my go-to when I'm looking for a brush pen that I can use for my illustrations. And I'm not inking everything. I'm only inking the areas that need to be kind of tightened up or need more contrast or need more definition. So other than inking the face and adding a little bit of extra detail or texture here and there, I'm mostly saving my inks for the underside, the cast shadow areas of the illustration. I find that doing inks this way keeps things a lot lighter and more airy. It doesn't deaden the illustration as much as doing enclosed inks might. I'm also adding a few strokes of ink to the grass itself, just here and there, just trying to tighten it up a little bit and continue to add a little bit more contrast. Now, I felt like this piece really could have used something, so at the bottom I added a few flecks of white gouache, or I'm sorry, bleed-proof white, just to kind of liven things up a little bit. But otherwise, we are finished. I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful, useful, and informative. Hopefully you guys will consider subscribing to my channel, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye, guys!